Anyway, I appreciate this opportunity to present on the Nooksack Indian Tribes Climate Change Program. And I'm here to introduce the scope and context of the climate change program, summarize the history of the climate change program, and describe the elements of the climate change program. This is a very large project involving many co-investigators and partners, some of which are here tonight to either participate and or give
recording in progress.
And I would like to particularly recognize Holly O'Neill, who has been a fantastic collaborator on almost all aspects of our climate change project. So thank you, Holly. The sources of funding for our project include EPA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative, as well as the Washington Department of Ecology. Our climate change project is robust, and it starts off by establishing baseline conditions, but not just baseline conditions, but also natural conditions and legacy impacts. And the reason it's important to tease out both legacy impacts and natural conditions from baseline conditions is because it makes has a big effect on how you go about doing your adaptation planning. And so this is natural conditions, and this represents the effect of legacy impacts on the environment. And so anyway, the point is that in doing a climate change project, you want to address cumulative impacts consisting of legacy impacts and climate change impacts. And so having established that, you go on to assess climate change impacts and combine climate change impacts with legacy impacts to identify cumulative impacts. And then you assess the vulnerability of those cumulative impacts on species, communities, habitats, and other elements of the natural and human environments. And you develop adaptation plans for those elements, including adaptation plans for fish habitat, fish, wildlife, indigenous foods, water supply, and water quality. And again, our project is very holistic because it doesn't just address climate change, but it also addresses legacy impacts, treaty resources, Endangered Species Act recovery, as well as Clean Water Act compliance in one comprehensive holistic project. Going on to the elements and projects of our overall climate change program, we started off addressing climate change as far back as 2011, when EPA and Washington Department of Ecology came to the tribe to invite us to participate in the South Fork Nooksack River Temperature Total Maximum Daily Load Project, or a TMDL. And the tribe provided some initial comments to those agencies on the scope of the TMDL project. And a TMDL is an evaluation process and a regulatory tool to help bring an impaired water body into compliance with the state and federal Clean Water Act standards. And so some of our comments included that if the TMDL is a tool to help clean up an impaired water body, shouldn't upland watershed processes be considered? Shouldn't legacy impacts be considered? Shouldn't reasonable natural conditions be considered? And more importantly, shouldn't it focus on impacts to fish, the designated or beneficial use of that water, not just the Clean Water Act numerical criteria? And relative to this forum, of course, climate change. We felt that if the TMDL was going to be an effective tool, it really ought to address climate change. And so the tribe substantially contributed to the TMDL through the draft and final document release in 2020, causing the TMDL to directly and comprehensively address climate change. And it was the first TMDL in the United States to directly address climate change. And it was issued again in February of 2020. Next up is a literature review we conducted on climate change in the Pacific Northwest and the Nooksack River watershed, including glacier behavior, completed in 2013. And that was conducted by Jezra Below, who is one of the Water Resource Program staff, and she conducted that literature review as a contractor. Now she is a full-time staff within our department. And that literature review provided the basis of the formulation of the tribe's climate change project. Next up would be the Shoals Glacier Monitoring Project, which was started in 2012. And it was a collaboration between Dr. Maury Pelto of Nichols College and the tribe starting in 2012 through the present. And again, we annually monitor conditions on the Shoals Glacier on the northeast flank of Mount Baker. And we keep track of a variety of parameters, including the aerial extent of the glacier, how much snow is retained on an annual basis. And as an example, here's the glacier in 2013, here's the glacier in 2029, and you can see that there is an area of recession and thinning of ice on the glacier. And in terms of the extent of the glacier, looking at the terminus of the glacier in 2012, the terminus of the glacier in 2021, and that represents about a 400 feet of recession since 2012. So climate change is having its effect on the glaciers in the Nooksack River watershed. Next up is our involvement with the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research Development, South Fork Nooksack River Climate Change Pilot Research Project. Through the tribe's involvement in the TMDL, which I previously mentioned, the Office of Research and Development was implementing the South Fork Climate Change Pilot Research Project that informed the TMDL. And that project relied heavily on the Nooksack Natural and Cultural Resources staff to do the analysis that was used in the pilot research project. And we were the primary authors of the qualitative assessment, which was produced in 2016. And the publication focused on climate change impacts on fish, vulnerability assessment, and resilience planning. And it was the first EPA publication that had tribal staff as senior authors. Next up is computer simulation of the effects of climate change on the hydrology of the Nooksack River. In 2015, we contracted Western Washington University, most notably Dr. Robert Mitchell, and his graduate student, Brian Murphy, to update the modeling of climate change impacts on the Nooksack River and the upper watershed that was originally conducted by Susan Dickerson Lang. And the reason I mentioned Susan at this point in time is because she's been integral to our continued climate change project. And I'll talk about her contribution later on. This project modeled the impacts of climate change on glacier extent. Next up is the South Fork Nooksack River Watershed Conservation Plan. Both the TMDL project and the EPA climate change project I previously mentioned recommended that a comprehensive watershed conservation plan be developed that addressed legacy impacts, water quality impairments, and climate change, taking community values and interests into consideration. An intensive and extensive public outreach and stakeholder engagement process was implemented in preparing the plan, and Holly O'Neill led that effort. And a draft plan was produced in 2017, and we are currently updating that plan, including the results of our more recent modeling efforts. Next up is the South Fork Nooksack River Reach Scale Plan. The tribe and collaborators, most notably Holly O'Neill and Crossroads Consulting, successfully obtained a competitive funding under the EPA Department of Ecology National Estuaries Program Riparian Protection and Restoration in Agricultural Lands Grant Program. The tribe prepared the South Fork Nooksack River Reach Scale Plan in 2017 that identified wetland and riparian properties on the South Fork Nooksack River floodplain with high priority for protection and restoration to address legacy impacts, as well as climate change impacts on the watershed function. That project ended up involving $980,000 of grant funding, a large portion of which went to reimburse Whatcom Land Trust for purchase of 2 riparian parcels totaling 77 acres. And the restoration actions were implemented on those areas, and protective conservation covenants placed across those parcels. Next up is computer simulation of the effects of climate change on the temperature and sediment loading of the Nooksack River. Once again, we contracted Dr. Robert Mitchell and his graduate students, Stephanie Truitt, to model the impacts of climate change on stream temperature in the Nooksack River, and Kevin Knapp to model the impacts of climate change on mass wasting in the Nooksack watershed. Next up is computer modeling to evaluate the effects of timber harvest on late summer flows in the Nooksack River. And the tribe contracted Natural Systems Design, most notably Susan Dickerson Lang, in 2018 to model the influence of commercial forestry on summer stream flows and how modifications to forestry could address the impacts of climate change on summer stream flows. This also involved evaluating the effects of gap cuts to facilitate snow accumulation in later season melt as a way to augment summer flows and offset climate change impacts. Next up is the Stewart Mountain Community Forest Initiative. The relevance and utility of a community forest in addressing legacy impacts as well as climate change impacts were recognized in the Watershed Conservation Plan, the TMDL, as well as the EPA's Climate Change Pilot Research Project. The tribe has been a founding member in the development of the Stewart Mountain Community Forest that aims to address water quality and flow issues in the South Fork, as well as offset forecast climate impacts. Alex Harris is here to inform us on that effort later on in this forum. Next up is the Black Slough Restoration Project. As an extension of the planning documents in the South Fork Nooksack watershed, the tribe has partially funded the restoration planning and implementation on a variety of parcels in Black Slough. This work acts on the analysis conducted in the South Fork Nooksack River Reach Scale Plan. Ian Smith is here to inform us on these efforts, and he'll give a presentation later in this forum. Next up is the Climate Change Impact Assessment, Vulnerability Assessment, and Adaptation Planning. The tribe contracted University of Washington Climate Impacts Group to conduct a species and communities vulnerability assessment that was completed in 2017. That effort focused on non-fish species and communities and habitats. And the reason for that is that we had already focused on the impact of climate change on fish in the EPA's Climate Change Research Project. The tribe contracted Climate Impacts Group to prepare a climate change adaptation plan for those species and communities, completed in 2020. And then more recently, the tribe contracted Climate Impacts Group again in 2020 to prepare a climate change adaptation implementation plan for select species and communities currently ongoing, which is the featured subject of this forum. Harriet Morgan is here to inform us on this project, and I will turn it over to Harriet. Thank you very much.